It was a cold, late winter morning in Hazleton, Pennsylvania, on March 18, 1964. 9-year-old Marise Ann Chiverella kissed her family goodbye and walked out the door for St. Joseph's parochial school. Normally, Marise and her siblings came home for lunch, but that day was different. The March air was crisp and still. Marise carried a basket of canned goods to give to her teacher. It was the day before the feast of St. Joseph, and as a Catholic schoolgirl, Marise had been helping gather food in celebration of the feast. This morning she set out along the familiar route of 5 or 6 city blocks to school. Dark Case Desk is where we explore the world's coldest cases with a relentless eye. Today, we bring you the story of Marise Chiverella, a sweet, shy 9-year-old whose life would be tragically cut short that March day. Along the way, if you find this investigation compelling, please give us a like, leave a comment, and make sure to subscribe to Dark Case Desk for more true crime stories. Marise said goodbye to her home as usual. The Chiverella family lived in a quiet neighborhood where everyone knew each other. At around 8 o'clock in the morning, Marise waved to her older siblings and set off toward St. Joseph's Academy, carrying her gloves and her bundle of contributions for the upcoming feast. Her mother packed her some sandwiches. Marise greeted each family member with a smile. In her innocence, Marise could not know that by the end of that day, her life and her family's world would change forever. For a short while, everything seemed normal. Marise walked toward school along her usual path. Her school friends and teachers saw her as a happy, gentle little girl, always eager to help. The morning was ordinary. Kids lining up in class, the teacher calling attendance, parents in their daily routines. But sometime not long after 8 in the morning, Marise never reached her destination. When lunchtime came, Carmen, Marise's older sister, and their brother Barry came home as usual. But Marise did not. Carmen later remembered the moment fear struck the family. "We came home for lunch and Marise wasn't there," she said. Her voice still shook with the memory. At first, everyone assumed she'd forgotten something and would return. But as each minute passed, hope turned to panic. Marise's father frantically told others to go back to school and look for her. A call was made to the school. The teacher reported Marise had not been in class that morning. Not a single student, from Marise's classmates to the homeroom teacher, had seen or heard from her that day. It became clear that something was terribly wrong. By late morning, the Chiverella home was in chaos. Her parents, her siblings, and neighbors raced through the snowy streets calling Marise's name. Police were notified. Neighbors searched the back alleys, and community volunteers combed every block of the neighborhood. The small town of Hazleton felt as if it held its breath. Rumors swirled in hushed tones. Had someone seen a girl being forced into a car? Who could have taken her? No one knew. Around 1 o'clock that afternoon, hope turned to horror. 3 miles from the Chiverella home, a coal mining area in Hazel Township became the scene of a nightmare. Arthur Robinson was giving his 16-year-old nephew a driving lesson near an old coal refuse pile on the outskirts of town. It was quiet out there, still and cold. As Arthur guided the car slowly along a bumpy road, the boy exhaled into the frosty air. Suddenly, Arthur squinted at something on the snowy slope ahead. At first, he thought it was a doll, a piece of discarded debris. He parked the car and walked down a steep embankment. The closer he got, the more certain he felt that the shape was not plastic or cloth, but a small human figure. Panic gripped him as he realized it was a child. It was Marise Ann Chiverella, or so he would come to understand moments later. Arthur immediately ran back to the car and sped off to call the state police. The boy remained at the scene as backup was summoned. Within minutes, troopers arrived on the scene. The hillside was roped off as they carefully made their way down the slope. There, lying face up on a bed of coal dust, was the body of 9-year-old Marise Chiverella. A police officer later recalled the horror of that moment. It was an absolute nightmare. She was lying there. It was a little girl. It was heartbreaking. Investigators saw that Marise's small hands and feet were bound. A scarf or cloth had been tied around her neck. Her winter coat and shoes were still on. Surprisingly clean for someone found at the bottom of a coal pit, it looked as if someone had placed her there after the crime. Marise's body showed the marks of brutal violence. The coroner's autopsy would later confirm that she had been strangled. Her neck bore deep marks of ligature. She also had severe bruises on her body. A medical examiner noted a large bruise on her abdomen, evidence of a powerful blow. The violence was nearly beyond belief. A gentle 9-year-old had been overpowered by someone monstrous. Yet there were no signs of her own blood at the scene, suggesting the killing had been done before moving her body. By mid-afternoon, Marise's family and the entire town of Hazleton learned what no one wanted to believe. Marise had been found, but not alive. Among the first on the scene was the priest from Street, Joseph's Academy, Reverend Father Lawrence. In the 1,960 seconds, it was customary for a priest to attend to the dying and give last rites. There on the hillside, Father Lawrence knelt beside the little girl's still form. He later identified her. It truly was Marise, the same kind girl he had seen at school, events, and Sunday Mass. The news spread through Hazleton like a shockwave. Flyers with Marise's photo went up, but now they were not looking for a lost child. They were searching for the killer. The policeman in charge of the investigation said quietly, "We have a dead child here, and we need to find who did this." Marise's body was taken to the county hospital. Inside, forensic technicians looked for evidence. In 1964, technology was primitive. They dusted for fingerprints, but found none that matched the girl. They collected hairs or fibers, if there were any, but nothing gave them a name. They meticulously bagged her clothing and any items for clues. Meanwhile, detectives arrived at the Chiverella home. They had to rule out every possible suspect, including her own family. Her mother, father, and siblings were questioned for hours. All said they were home and accounted for that morning. No one had seen Marise leave with anyone suspicious. The family was devastated and insisted they had nothing to hide. Friends and neighbors were questioned, but nobody recalled seeing Marise after she left that morning. With no eyewitness and no obvious suspect, police had very little to go on. Her route to school was next to impossible to trace without a witness. Officers knocked on the doors of every home within about a 5-block radius. Each neighbor was asked to recall if they had seen anything unusual, a strange car, a man acting oddly, or the girl walking. Some remembered little Marise smiling at them earlier. None had seen her disappear. One neighbor, when asked if she had any idea where Marise was, yelled over to Marise's frantic father that his daughter had been found, already implying death. By evening, police had a painful conclusion. Nothing in the investigation pointed to a living suspect. Detective James Barron, not his real name, who would spend decades on the case, later recalled the terrible realization. We had a little girl murdered, and we were still stuck at square one. In the days that followed, news of the murder spread. The child's funeral drew crowds. Hazleton's church was packed. Parents, teachers, and neighbors stood in solemn silence to pay respects to Marise. Local papers ran heartbreaking photographs. One showed Marise's mother leaning over the coffin to give her daughter a final kiss. A caption read, "Farewell, kiss from mother as coffin closed." The image drove home a chilling truth. A mother was burying her child. Parents in town felt sick. They gathered their own children a little tighter after that. Marise's friends, home-eating classmates, and school staff were left with empty seats in the cafeteria and unanswered questions in their hearts. "We have so many precious memories of Marise," her sister Carmen said later. "At the same time, our family will always feel the emptiness and sorrow of her absence." The community shared her pain. Everybody wanted answers, wanted justice. "Parents aren't supposed to outlive their children," neighbors whispered. Every parent wondered aloud, why would anyone do this? Investigators worked round the clock for weeks. They re-interviewed witnesses, rechecked all leads, and followed hunches. They even brought in psychologists and profilers, trying to get inside the mind of the killer. But as the months passed, nothing cracked. No one confessed. The investigation soon reached a dead end. By the end of 1964, exhausted officers reluctantly gave up active searching. The case was filed away as unsolved homicide, a chilling acronym in the archives. And so the case of young Marise Chiverella went cold for decades, nearly 6 of them. Hazleton tried to move on, but Marise's family never forgot. Her parents, though heartbroken, always held on to hope. Marise's 5 siblings grew up without their baby sister, forever haunted by that loss. In quiet moments, they wondered, what really happened? Inside the Pennsylvania State Police headquarters, detectives passed the file along. Over the years, more than 250 state troopers would glance at that case file, looking for anything missed. The file itself ballooned in size. By 2020, it would contain over 6,000 pages of reports, witness statements, autopsy photos, and police notes. Yet it held no names, no answers. The official conclusion remained: unknown assailant. In the meantime, Polaroid photos of missing children became a common sight on milk cartons, and the term cold case entered law enforcement parlance. But in 1964, none of that existed. DNA analysis would not emerge until decades later. Back then, if a killer was smart, they simply disappeared. For Marise's family, this meant living for years in limbo. They never knew if the person who killed her was still out there. They could only pray he would make a mistake. Community memory of the crime simmered over the years. Whenever someone visited Hazleton, old-timers would say, "Remember when Marise Chiverella was killed?" They never caught him. For the townspeople, it was a ghost story of sorts, a wicked act committed and seemingly forgotten. The annual Feast of Street Joseph passed each year without fanfare from the Chiverellas, the once bright celebration dimmed by tragedy. In Washington, D.C., and in the halls of the state capitol, new law pushed forward. DNA profiling was invented in the mid-1980s, and then CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, launched in the late 1990s. Police in Hazleton kept the Chiverella evidence locked in a vault, knowing that someday modern science might help, but for a long time, nothing changed on the cold case front. Finally, in the spring of 2007, 43 years after the crime, investigators gave the cold case another look. They dusted off Marise's preserved clothing and sent samples to the Pennsylvania State Police Crime Lab. Using advanced methods, the lab technicians were able to detect a small biological sample on Marise's blouse. It was something no one could test back in the 60s. Now they could see it was a fluid that contained the killer's DNA. Laboratory staff extracted the DNA profile and ran it through CODIS, hoping for a match with any convicted felon. The file was uploaded and the computers searched, but there was nothing. The killer's DNA was not in the database. This wasn't surprising. CODIS only includes people who have been arrested and had their DNA taken. If Marise's killer had never been caught before, he wouldn't be there. Another dead end. Detective Barron and his colleagues had no match. But they did have something new, a genetic blueprint of the suspect. For the first time, the killer's DNA was out of its bottle. The breakthrough would come later, when DNA genealogy became a tool. Years passed. By 2017, Detective Thomas Miller, a name chosen for this narrative, took command of the case. He was younger, tech-savvy, and determined. He spent long hours poring over the massive case file. Over 6,000 pages of frustration stared back at him. But Detective Miller had heard about cutting-edge forensic genealogy, using DNA to trace a killer through family trees. This method had recently helped solve other old cases. He wondered, could it work here? In early 2018, Pennsylvania State Police partnered with Parabon Nanolabs, a company specializing in investigative genetic genealogy. Parabon agreed to upload Marise's DNA profile to public ancestry databases, where people use DNA to find relatives. The databases returned a list of distant relatives, people who shared some DNA markers with the killer. But this was just a maze of names, potentially hundreds of people, most of whom were too distantly related to be obvious suspects. Enter Eric Schubert, an unlikely hero from this point of view. Eric was a young college student studying in Lancaster County. He had no connection to Hazleton, but since childhood, he loved genealogy. He was 20 years old, an Elizabethtown College student, with a passion for tracing family trees. In February 2020, Eric stumbled onto a news article about the Marise case while browsing the internet. The story of the young girl haunted him. Eric knew his hobby might be helpful. He decided to act. "I just couldn't get the story out of my head," Eric later said. Without telling anyone, he composed a respectful email to the Pennsylvania State Police. He wrote about his skills and his offer to help. To his surprise, they replied. They set up a meeting at a coffee shop near campus. Detective Miller and Sergeant Jessica Anderson, our fictional names, met the young man. Eric came with a laptop full of family tree charts and reference books. He described how he could build family trees from DNA clues. The detectives were intrigued. Here was a volunteer, intensely intelligent, who claimed he could take that list of genetic leads and turn it into names. They gave him the green light. The case became Eric's obsession. Over the next 18 months, he dedicated virtually every free hour to it. "I spent up to 20 hours a week on Marise's case," he recalled. He dug through census records, old immigration lists, newspaper archives, and social media. Each DNA relative was a thread. Eric traced their ancestry back generation by generation. Bit by bit, he connected family trees. His work felt like hunting in a labyrinth. He built dozens of complete family trees, charting every baby, every marriage. It was as if he mapped out an entire village of ancestors. Slowly, a pattern emerged. One branch of a large Italian-American family showed promise. Eric discovered a man who immigrated from Italy to Hazleton in 1904, the grandfather of suspects. This grandfather had many descendants in Hazleton. Eric then traced those descendants to find anyone alive, or who had been alive, around 1964. He homed in on two brothers, James and his older brother. Both men had lived in Hazleton when Marise was killed. Neither brother was ever known to Marise or her family, but both had suspicious pasts. The brothers had criminal records for violence. Importantly, neither had DNA in the criminal database. They had walked free for years. By 22, both brothers were already dead. With two prime suspects who couldn't be questioned, the puzzle entered its final phase. Investigators tracked down relatives of each brother to find living DNA. They found the older brother's widow. The police asked her permission for a DNA test. She had an old hairbrush of his. In December 2021, a sample from those bristles was tested, and the results were clear. It was not a match to the DNA from the crime scene. The older brother was eliminated. That left just one name, 22-year-old James Paul Forte. A Hazleton bartender at the time of the murder, he had moved out of state and returned, but had no known family in Hazleton aside from that Italian lineage. He had died in 1980 of a heart attack at age 38. Police now believed James Paul Forte was very likely the killer. But they had only genealogy to hang on to, and a grave. The law required undeniable proof. Detective Miller met with the county district attorney. They decided, to confirm James was the killer, they needed his DNA. But since he was buried decades ago, the only option was to exhume his body. On February 3, 2022, almost 58 years after Marise's murder, authorities exhumed James Paul Forte's remains from a local cemetery. They took a tissue sample under strict protocols. It was a moment of high drama. State police had pinned this old murder on a man buried nearly 42 years earlier. The sample was rushed to the state lab. A tense week passed. Then, the lab report arrived. It was a perfect match. The genetic profile from James Forte's DNA matched the profile from the stain on Marise's blouse left on that cold morning in 1964. The odds that it was anyone else were essentially 0. 1 in a septillion, one trooper said. After nearly 6 decades, the killer's identity was finally proven. On February 12, 2022, Pennsylvania State Police announced the breakthrough at a news conference. Captain Anthony Petrosky, the public information officer, took the podium. He named the suspect. Our investigation has identified the killer of Marise Chiverella. It was a bartender named James Paul Forte. He stressed that Forte had never been arrested for this crime. He had died in 1980 of natural causes, so there would be no trial. Reporters pressed for details. Detective Miller explained how a bystander's DNA sample from the crime scene, helped by modern genealogy, led to Forte's name. He noted Forte had no connection to Marise or her family. His identification came solely from detective work. This is the oldest cold case in Pennsylvania solved by genetic genealogy, Miller said. Closure and reflection. For Marise's family, the news brought a mixture of emotions. Her sister Carmen, standing with other family members at the conference, found strength to speak. "We have so many precious memories of Marise," she said, voice quivering. "At the same time, our family will always feel the emptiness and sorrow of her absence. We will continue to ask ourselves, what would have been, what could have been?" She paused and then declared, "We never sought revenge. We just wanted justice. And thanks to the Pennsylvania State Police, justice has been served." Her brother Ron added, eyes shining with tears, "There's an emptiness there that's never going to change. But now that we do know, it helped close that door. It's a blessing." For the first time in nearly 60 years, the Chiverella family had an answer, however painful. Hazleton, too, felt a weight lifted. Ron Marchetti, a local historian who remembers the case well, told reporters, "I'm just glad it's solved. That's all I can say." Finally, after all these years, the man who found Marise's body decades ago, Arthur Robinson, was finally able to see some closure. In the end, the facts were laid bare. James Paul Forte, a former Hazleton bartender with a history of violence, was the man who murdered Marise. He had no explanation and gave no testimony, having passed away decades before. But now the truth was known. The records of Marise's death were finally complete. Marise Ann Chiverella's name, once whispered only in pain and fear, now carried the final, long-delayed word, solved. This case remains a chilling example of perseverance and new technology bringing justice. It shows that even when a trail goes cold, sometimes the answers find you. If you found Marise's story compelling, please show your support. Like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to Dark Case Desk. We continue to dig into dark mysteries and bring you the stories of cases both old and new. Thank you for watching. Stay vigilant, stay compassionate, and join us next time on Dark Case Desk. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe for more true crime investigations.